How do you change another person's mind? Influence lies at the heart of relationship, and the power of conversations is one of my favorite topics. I'm Michelle Martin. Welcome to the program. My guest, Marcia Reynolds, is author of The Discomfort Zone, a book that was just launched this Monday, I understand. It uses a model for conversation that diffuses resistance, encourages people to think through their own situation strategically, and talks about listening from different centers of your body, and how that sort of listening can lead to the kind of questions that challenge and change habitual thought patterns. How much more challenging would it be to situate this particular model for conversation within a cross-cultural setting? Would it still work? Well, we're going to find out. Marcia Reynolds joins us now in WOW, or Women of Worth. Marcia, thank you so much for being on the air with us.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Could we start with a couple of examples from your experience of coaching across cultures? And do you think your model for diffusing discomfort still works cross-culturally?
Well, I actually have been teaching around the world for many, many years, and I find that when you're teaching ways of listening, that always crosses cultures. It's the way of communicating that can change. So since this model really depends on how we listen and reflect back to people what they're saying, and then just question, based on what you hear, it does work. It's really more about, do you have the courage to do that? And that can change based on not just cultures, but just individuals.
Could you share with us a couple of case studies of how you have helped leaders across different cultures, for example, deal with discomfort, as you define it in the book?
Okay. Well, there's really two discomforts that we're talking about. The book primarily is looking at how do you create maybe an uncomfortable moment in the person you're talking to that makes them stop and think about what they're doing, which is always a little uncomfortable when we recognize our blind spots or our what we hadn't seen before. But the other discomfort is in the leader that's holding the conversation. So we start there because most of the time, really most of the places I've been, people avoid a conversation that may seem to be, that is going to be uncomfortable. We just have a natural tendency to protect ourselves, and so we don't want to have those conversations that people are going to show some emotion, they may be defensive, we just don't want to do that. And then I find, in many Asian cultures, the idea that I may have to deliver a difficult message is a little bit harder than in let's say, particularly in Europe, and in the U.S. We're in the middle of how well we like to. We're a little polite sometimes, so we don't like to deliver the difficult message. So it starts with the leader getting comfortable and setting an emotional intention, and knowing that this conversation is really for the person's growth and development. It's not punishment or to fix them, that the conversation is about truly helping them to grow. And when you understand that, and then breathe and move into that space, what is the purpose of a leader anyway? But to help people to grow, to learn and to grow. So we start with the leader's courage in this situation, and then move into what it is that they're going to create together.
Wonderful. We're going to dive into the nuts and bolts of your system in just a while, but I want to start off by saying that this system doesn't talk about avoiding the discomfort associated with difficult, provocative conversations, correct?
Right.
It gives you a model for dealing with provocative ideas and conversations.
Yeah. Particularly when you're dealing with somebody who's sort of stuck or they're resistant to change, then telling them to change doesn't work. Just expecting that they'll learn somehow and they'll change doesn't work. So we're having to look at what else could work in this situation. So when I say create discomfort, discomfort could be just a momentary shock, like, oh, I haven't seen that before, all the way to, oh, I've been doing this for years, this is terrible. And so sometimes people get very upset with themselves when they recognize the truth. So it's not like we're telling someone they're wrong or they're bad, because that's not what's happening here. We're just helping them to see themselves and the world in a different way that they hadn't seen before. And again, because they hadn't seen this, in that moment they could be embarrassed, they could be sad that they hadn't seen it, they could be angry, but usually it subsides. So we're wanting to create that experience so they can break through the resistance or the stuck place in their perception. So it's good in that sense.
So it doesn't mean avoiding confrontation, but you're really going for the sort of questions that are going to jolt people out of habitual thought patterns. In what ways is your work supported by what neuroscience is telling us about the ways we learn?
Well, actually, that's what my research has been for years. Both of my second master's was in adult learning. My doctorate was in learning psychology, and it's fascinating that we used to think that there was one method of learning, that you learned and you lodged things into long-term memory. What we realize now is that there's actually 3 different ways that we learn. There's fact-based learning. If we're interested in the facts, we'll remember. If we're not that interested, we don't. We forget. So that's not that efficient, and that only builds on what we want to learn. And then there's skill-based learning and fear-based learning. And a lot of leaders will use fear. If you don't do this terrible thing will happen. When I learn that way, I learn one particular way. I learn that this is important and I have to do this to survive. So then if you ask me to change that way, to be slightly creative, I can't, because it's lodged deep into my primitive brain. And so that's one of the most inefficient ways to learn, is to use fear.
That is fascinating, that it actually stifles an individual's ability to be cognitive and creative and think for themselves, because they're stuck in a particular mode of learning.
Right. Well, it's because it gets lodged deep into the primitive brain. There's no more access to the middle brain where long-term memory exists. So they cannot then get into the library of memories and reattach and recreate to have a new perception. It's not possible. It takes them almost like learning something brand new to change. So it's just because it's down. That's the place where we learn, like skills. Like you learn how to drive a car, and then you don't have to think about it. You just drive, even though there's a lot of people on the road not thinking. But you just do it. It's called automatic pilot. And so that's a necessary part of learning. But the problem is that's also where fear gets, and fear-based learning gets lodged. So we go into automatic pilot, and it's very difficult to change. And that, isn't it true? That's the way leaders have been teaching people for years. And that's even their own defenses. They don't want to get into a conversation with someone, so they'll just say, well, you have to change. If you don't, you may not be able to keep your job, or you won't get a promotion. And again, that's so inefficient. So the way what we want people to learn is what we call insight-based learning. And this is where we really get into changing how the person sees themselves in the world. And that's lodged in the middle brain. That's what we call ego, how I define myself, who I am, and the world, and my place in the world around me.
Insight-based learning. This sounds very similar to the sort of conversational patterns that I once experienced when I was training and trying to understand a little bit more about counseling. And they urge you to hold a mirror up, for example, and not give an individual a solution, but sort of lead them to an insight of their own. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. It is. A lot of cognitive behavioral therapies were based on that, helping people to recognize their limitations, and so from that they can then see what's possible. And actually, coaching technique. This is deeply based in what really more advanced coaching technique, so where it's not really problem solving, but it's really opening up to seeing new possibilities. When we see, there's a quote that Richard Boyatz said recently. He said, "You can't see beyond the box until you see the box." Mm-hmm. And that's what we're helping people to see, the box that limits them.
How do we do that? How do we do that? So we start with trust, and we build a space of non-judgment almost, and then what? And we move with this intention of positivity. It sounds like an intention to see the person. I like that. When you talk about seeing the individual or the humanity, the humanness of the person that you're talking to, and not the rank. You're not talking to a subordinate or a boss. And then where do we go from there, Marcia?
Yeah. Well, I want to reiterate that. You're so right, that to have these conversations, because they may be a little uncomfortable, it has to be a very safe space. So the person needs to know that you're there for them, that you respect them, and you're really wanting them to find possibilities. They have to sense that intention, that you're there for them. Then when you get into it, it always starts with allowing them to tell their story, because you have to listen to the way they define how they see their situation, because that's what you're going to feed back to them.
Right.
So the two main techniques are mirroring, just saying, so you're telling me this, or I sense that you're frustrated because nobody's listening to you. So you start by mirroring back to them, because when we hold up the mirror and people start to see themselves, oftentimes that's all you need to do. It's amazing when people say, oh, well, yeah, I guess I've been thinking that. Like I had a client, and she had kind of blown up in a meeting. And I said, so what are you angry about? And she said, well, nobody has my back, and they just aren't supporting me. And I said, so nobody on your team supports your work. And she goes, well, maybe that's not true. They have all their things to do, and so they're just busy with their stuff. So you start to look for the gaps in the logic. And then I bring it down to, so again, I'm going to ask you, who are you really angry at? Mm-hmm. And there's always a long pause when you break through that
That's
moment.
when you know you've hit insight moment.
Exactly. And her answer to me was, I'm really angry at myself. And then we get to the truth of what's happening. So it's this mirroring and then asking the question that makes them stop and question themselves.
And I love the model that you give us for listening with your whole body, and I really want to get into that in detail. When we come back, more from my guest, Marcia Reynolds, author of The Discomfort Zone. We're learning today about a model for conversation that can diffuse resistance. And if influence is all about being able to change a person's mind, so to speak, or help them come to a different realization, then this is the show you really need to stay tuned to. Wow continues after this.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Welcome to Wow, or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. My guest this evening is Marcia Reynolds. She's the author of The Discomfort Zone, How Leaders Turn Difficult Conversations into Breakthroughs. The book has just been launched Monday this week. She joins us all the way from Arizona, where it is very early in the morning. So big thank you, Marcia, once again for this interview. Thank you so much for allowing us to understand a little bit more about how leaders can use conversation in such a positive way. I love the way your system looks at listening as a very important means to keep conversations flowing. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to talk about listening as opposed to just sending out a message, which is what people think about when they think of leadership coaching?
Right. Well, oftentimes in these conversations, people focus on, I have to deliver feedback, and so it's their message. Instead of working with, how can I help the person see a different way? Because when we discover for ourselves that there's another possibility, then we commit to the change. When somebody tells us, we don't necessarily commit. So the process is really based in listening deeply for what is it that the person, what's getting in the way, what's the barriers to them seeing themselves differently, maybe bigger, that they can do other things, or that they're seeing the world slightly different, so they don't see the possibilities.
Can you tell us about listening from the different centers of the body? This is just fascinating.
Sure. Well, what I was trying to do, there's so many coaches that talk about, they use intuition. Well, but what is intuition? And it's so difficult to teach it. And so when I got into my research, I found that, the nervous system is how we take in and process information. And we always focus on the brain. Yet the nervous system actually has three major processing centers. And so there's the brain, but there's the heart and the gut. How many times do you say, I should have listened to my heart, or why didn't I go with my gut? Well, in the gut, there's 100 million neurons in your gut, and every class of neurotransmitter that's in your brain. That's far more than you need to digest food. And so there's a lot of we take in input, and then we send these signals to the brain. But then the brain kind of filters things out in sensors. If we stop the censoring and truly just open up and listen with both our heart and our gut, it's amazing when I teach this exercise, and I teach people to listen from their centers and to ask the questions that emerge from these points. The questions are always different, and they're always far more powerful and make such a difference to the person that they're with. So when people say, well, give me a list of questions I can ask that'll, make people see things differently. Well, it's like if you're reading a list of questions, you're in your cognitive brain. But I teach them, and that's what I'm going to teach when I come to Singapore. When I teach them how to listen from these centers, it's like the right questions always emerge. They hear when they listen more deeply. They hear exactly what they need.
This is exactly why I don't send out talk show questions, because I want people to speak from their heart and from their gut, so to speak, from a place of authenticity, and not have everything scripted out and just read out their answers or come from one dimension.
Spontaneous.
Yes.
Right. It has to be. It has to be.
And this is a teachable skill coming from...
Absolutely. And it's cross-cultural, because I've taught it in a number of places, in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, as well as the United States, because we're talking about the human being and the human body. We're not talking about methods of communicating. So it is teachable, and it's very difficult to learn on your own. So even in the book where I say how to do this, I always say, you've got to go do this with somebody else and have somebody read the visualization and walk you through it to help you to do it on your own. It's very hard just to do it. So again, that's why I'll be there the last week of November I'm there for a writer's workshop, and then I'm there for 2 days leadership training where I'll be teaching these techniques.
Yes, we just talked to Jacqueline from Sequoia to find out more about the Writing for Change workshop. So readers and listeners, if you're interested, you can head to the Sequoia Group's website for more information on that. So when you talk about listening from the different centers, you're not just talking about moving your awareness, for example, to your gut. Because when I first chanced upon this notion of yours of listening with the entire body, I thought the key perhaps to getting more information or different questions was about really centering yourself and being more present than ever in your own body and therefore in the moment. Is this part of the reason why you get different questions when you listen from different centers of your body, that you are more present in yourself?
Well, definitely, because anything that brings you out of your head. So sometimes when I teach, and if people they may be resistant to the idea of, well, I'm going to listen to my heart, because it makes them feel uncomfortable. But I say just go. If you go in and move your awareness in, it gets you out of your head. And so there's a deeper listening regardless. Mm-hmm. And they'll say that to me, well, I don't know if I really listened from my heart and my gut, but I actually was listening much more deeply. And the questions change. It's like when we listen from these centers, we can actually hear what is it the person really wants? What is it they need? Why are they disappointed? Or what are they truly afraid of? Instead of just looking at their belief systems. You know, we talked about cognitive therapy where you look at limiting beliefs. Well, that's still very cognitive in the brain. But when we listen more deeply, we hear actually what's getting in the way from them seeing themselves in the world in a bigger way.
It's fascinating. So you're teaching people a method of receiving information with their whole nervous system then. And along the way, I think you've come up with a great definition for intuition, which is stop censoring your brain. I love that.
Yeah. Well, you know, there was a really interesting study done where they were mapping the brains of rappers, creating their rap music. And it's very similar to the model I have in the discomfort zone in the book, where they start very intentionally, you know, where they want to go. They know the end result. You know, they wrap it up at the end very intentionally. But in the middle, they found that the brain of rappers, it's like this censoring and monitoring cognitive part of the brain went very quiet, which allowed them to get into this full creativity and spontaneity in the moment, and just to speak what comes forth. And it's the same thing in this model, is that you actually quiet that cognitive analyzing brain. And so you could actually hear more deeply, and it's not even a matter of courage. You just then share what comes forth. And it's always so amazing and powerful. And the experience for the person you're with, that they even feel you've heard them so deeply that makes such a difference to them, whether they fully understand themselves in the moment or not.
Tell us about three-centered listening and what this means. This sounds a little bit challenging. It sounds like, you know, how people feel in Pilates for the first time of how do I hold my core in and still keep breathing, and what is lateral breathing? So how do people, you know, keep listening to different parts of their body and listening to another person as well, three-centered listening?
Well, you know, that's interesting because we actually are quite capable of self-observation as well as listening to someone else when we aren't in our cognitive brain. So when I'm with someone, it's an interesting thing. I'm a risk taker, so I listen from my head and my gut fairly well. The place that it's difficult for me is my heart. And so if I'm with somebody and I'm stuck, I don't know what to say, I don't know what question to ask, I always know, go to your heart, because I bet that's where it is. That's the vulnerable place for me. And it's amazing what question comes forth is always the one that makes the difference. Where helpers, people who are really intent on helping people, they tend to listen from their head and their heart, and they don't access their gut. And I always say, what is your gut saying? And it's amazing that can come forth. So it's not like I'm so focused on me, I can't hear them. It's just an awareness And again, when we're aware of what's going on in us and are not stuck in our cognitive brain, we can actually have that awareness as well as fully listening to the person we're with. And it takes a little practice. So I'm not saying you can, just go out and be perfect at it. And so, again, that's why I teach it and I encourage people to practice it on a daily basis. Let me just listen to my heart for a while. Let me listen to my gut. Even when you have a big decision to make, ask your head what's important, but then ask your heart and then ask your gut. And it's amazing what comes forth, even when you want to make your own decisions.
This is fascinating to me because, in martial arts, and I'm a big lover of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a form of martial arts, this idea of moving from your center, which is considered your dantian or your power core, is central to the way you think. Yeah. The way you think in martial arts as well.
I took Aikido for 5 years, so absolutely, your point of strength
yes.
is the core of your body. Why would you not access that in a difficult conversation?
And so metaphorically, to move from that makes sense to me as well. Do women tend to, can we take a gendered view of this model of listening? Are more women comfortable in their head and heart than their gut? Do you find that you have to teach women to access their gut more than any other center?
That's an interesting stereotype.
It is.
I've found in the workplace that, women have worked so hard to be strong because they need to be heard. There's, those women, that they don't access their heart. They feel very vulnerable there. So there's some women that are very good, again, more your risk takers, where, again, if they're more of a helper. So it's not that all women do that. It really just depends on what have they used to be successful in their career, their heart or their gut more. And that's what they've developed.
Does this model of listening and communicating work in the organization where we know that so many big organizations depend on a sort of militarized, hierarchical mode of communication almost, where information flows downwards and things need to be done efficiently, and so there's this practical, efficient sort of language even that you see in email exchanges at the office. So, does this model work in the office? And how?
Again, I always come back to when I teach leadership. What is the purpose of leadership? Is it just to get things done, or are you there to develop people? And honestly, the higher you move up in leadership, the purpose is to develop other leaders. So you want to develop their minds as well as their skills. And if you want people to be more efficient and get things done, then help them to see things differently. So I find that the leaders that are most remembered and revered and significant to people are the ones that, helped me to see things differently, to change my mind. Even if they challenged me in a way that was uncomfortable, I always remember that leader is the most important to me. Mm-hmm. So I come back to who are you as a leader, and what is it that is the most significant thing you can do for people? And I think expanding their minds so they can, step up and do things on their own in a bigger way is more significant for leaders.
Coming up, some tools you listeners can use instantly to change minds. My guest is Marcia Reynolds. She's a leadership coach and author of The Discomfort Zone. We'll be back in just a while.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Welcome to Women of Worth. Wow, my name is Michelle Martin, and my guest this evening, Marcia Reynolds. What an amazing tool she's created and put out there in the world through her book, The Discomfort Zone, a book that provides such pragmatic strategies to reach individuals, to communicate, to bring about and catalyze change, whether it's at the organization or even outside it, I think. Marcia, I went to your website and I saw that you have a great article on tools that listeners can use to instantly change minds. So I want to come to you and ask you, out of the top of your head or from your gut maybe, some tools that listeners can use that will be useful for them.
Well, actually, the tools of reflection and exploring, to remember that's what you're doing, to always start by clarifying to the person, listen to their stories, and then just ask them to clarify. Reflect back what they're saying. That's so powerful, and people just don't do it. I just want to give a quick example. I was working with a leadership team, and they were very upset because their leader was leaving, and they were telling me all these terrible things about what was going to happen. And I allowed them to tell the story, and then I said, I understand you're very afraid about what's going to happen. You're angry because you don't get to choose your new leader. You're a little disappointed. There's a lot of things you feel. But what do you know to be true right now? So I reflected their feelings and their story and then asked them, what do you know to be true? And in all honesty, all they knew to be true was their leader was leaving. And so we clarified what's the truth today. Mm-hmm. And then we could say, so what do you need to do right now? And they said, well, I guess we need to shore up our succession planning so we can weather any leader. So it's simply, tools of reflection, and then you ask about what you hear. Those are the most powerful tools you can use when you're helping someone to think through their difficult situation.
To get them to the aha moments. Marcia, it's been absolutely wonderful chatting with you. We're flat out of time, so I want to say a big, big thank you to Marcia Reynolds, who will be in Singapore at the end of November, I understand, for Writing for Change workshop. Marcia, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Hope to see everyone when I'm in Singapore.
Absolutely.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.